Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope you enjoy this conversation coming to you from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Welcome to episode 6 of season 3 of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby, and Momentum for Change is a monthly podcast brought to you by the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence to lift up voices of the Missouri movement. We are going to be talking about public policy today, and I am joined by 2 remarkable voices of the Missouri movement. It is a balmy, warm day in June here in Missouri. But just last month, at the beginning of May, the Missouri General Assembly wrapped up their 2024 legislative session. In addition, just last week, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence and the National Network to End Domestic Violence hosted National Advocacy Days in Washington, D.C. Here to talk to us about both of those developments are 2 champions of the Missouri anti-violence movement, Dr. Sara Brammer, Vice President of Family Violence Services at Synergy Services in Kansas City, and Jessica Woolbright, the Executive Director of St. Martha's Hall in St. Louis. Sara and Jessica, thank you both so much for being here. We appreciate the time, experience, and wisdom that you bring to the Public Policy Committee. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Would you all like to start off by introducing yourselves? And you both have spent quite a bit of time in the anti-violence movement. So I'd love if you'd like to share how much time you have been involved in this work.
I'll go first. This is Jessica Woolbright. I have been with St. Martha's for almost 24 years. So I started part-time when I was in graduate school and never left because I was fortunate enough to find my dream job and have found ways to keep finding new ways to advocate, and it's working.
And I know that you have had such a positive impact on so many lives of women and children, so many survivors of violence over the years. So it's really an honor to have you here, Jessica.
Thank you.
Sara, would you like to go next?
So I started in the domestic violence movement at the Columbia shelter in the 90s. And I worked there while I was finishing my degrees at Mizzou, and then came to get my master's and PhD in Kansas City. Then I started working, my first practicum was at Synergy in the year 2000. So the beginning of my 25th year is in August.
Wow.
So I feel like I've been in the movement most of my adult life.
Wow, that is so interesting. And to hear that, I didn't even know you began in mid-Missouri, but also to be celebrating a quarter of a decade at Synergy Services is just so exciting. Well, I'm really happy to have you both on the podcast with the wealth of experience that you bring to this conversation. So you both serve on the MOCADSV Public Policy Committee. What do you see as the role of this committee, or how do you explain it to just, somebody who's asking what the Public Policy Committee does?
I would say that the role of the Public Policy Committee is to keep some general organization of what the coalition's kind of primary targets are in terms of bill filings and our general advocacy work, so we can all be on the same page.
That's wonderful. I mean, the coalition is an organization that was founded by our members, and we are really committed to staying informed by our members. And the Public Policy Committee, as you said, really does keep us on track, keeps us organized, and keeps us committed and informed by our members. So thanks for that description. Anything you would add, Jessica?
Yeah, I would add, so it took me a long time to realize how and why public policy is so important. So when I first started doing this work, I was I had a lot of pride in the fact that I did direct service, right? That I was boots on the ground, working in the shelter. I was not in grad school. I was not one of those students that loved the public policy class. It was something I had to do to get through it. And then the longer you do this work, the more you make that connection between why public policy is so important, because it impacts those boots on the ground services and what we have the ability to do, as well as the challenges. So I think the other really important piece of the committee is that there is power in numbers. And when you have a connection across the state, across the region, we can all share how particular bills can or could impact our work, that you start to see that it's so much bigger than just one person or one agency.
Yes, I love that. You're so right. And that is, I think, so much of where our commitment to members is as a coalition, is providing those alliance building opportunities that bring members together, because we can make change happen when we are organized, like you said, Sara, and coordinating our services. So I love, that's going to stick in my head for a long time, Jessica. We are power in numbers.
Right.
Well, and it really boosts the signal, the shared collective idea of what best practices is in domestic violence. It boosts the signal for that, so we're all on the same page. And Jessica, I just want to follow up a little bit about the direct service. It's also interesting to see how much things have changed. In the 90s, when I worked at a shelter, we had 24-hour shifts. And if you think about that in today's day, there's just no frame of reference for a 24-hour shift, and whether that was even legal.
It probably wasn't, right?
No, I'm sure it wasn't, but maybe it was then. But just things have changed so much. The evolution of direct service is so interesting to watch.
Yeah, it truly is. And that really resonated with me a lot too, Jessica, when you were talking about the pride in doing direct services and being that kind of frontline effort, because I felt the same way. And it was the longevity of the work that really inspired me to get involved with public policy and violence prevention. I think, I didn't have that same passion that I have now for violence prevention when I first started working in the movement. And now, a couple of years in, I certainly do have that passion for prevention that I think I got from doing that direct services, but it wasn't something that I always had as I started working this movement. So I'm glad you said that.
Well, I don't think everybody has public policy classes. Like, I didn't get one. So you just have to get into the movement. I think direct service totally informs your willingness and desire to do that work.
Yeah. And I think there's something about that direct service when, as you're stepping away, doing maybe prevention or public policy work, it's always with those survivors that you worked with, providing direct services in mind. Like, you always think of their faces, their stories, their kids, and it's always with those survivors in mind that I think informs a lot of the not direct service work, right?
Can I just give an example? Like, it just makes me laugh because it's literally popping up on my phone as we speak, that we just had somebody drop off a cash donation at the drop-in center, which is fabulous, right? Mm-hmm. And the person who dropped it off, it represents a dispensary, a marijuana dispensary. And they were very specific that they wanted the cash to go to St. Martha's, which is fabulous. And my finance director is texting me like, don't know if we can take this, right? Like we have federal funds and federal grants, and I'm not sure what they think about this. So it's that funny, like, this is why public policy matters, right? Yeah. Like, in theory, it sounds really great, but then all of a sudden you have to think 5 steps ahead. That
absolutely.
So I don't know the answer, Spoiler alert, I will find out today and let everybody know, but it just seemed like a timely scenario to share.
Speaks like to how fast this work really does change. Because a decade ago, we couldn't have imagined having that issue come up.
Right. Oh boy.
Well, you all both are extremely busy people. You're running shelters and outreach centers and batterers intervention services. many things, among other things, but you still make time to work on public policy in your local communities and at the statewide level in the Public Policy Committee and the national level by going to DC from time to time. And so you spoke to this a little bit, especially you, Jessica, but I wanted to know if there's anything else that you wanted to add about why public policy is such an important part of your domestic violence advocacy.
Because I think it's that with power comes responsibility. So if we're going to have a shelter, if we're going to have a drop-in center, there's a lot of power that comes with that. Mm-hmm. And we have to be responsible with it. So we don't have to be ashamed of it, but we do have to be wise, and we have to make sure that we have the information that we need to minimize the risk as much as possible for those we serve. And we have a responsibility to, I guess it's both. We have a responsibility to serve the people that are in our shelter today, and an obligation to do everything we can to put our shelter out of business, right? Like I would love, we're fighting two battles, the short term and the long term.
Yeah.
And this is how you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that no matter how many services we provide, shelter beds that we are able to provide bed nights in, there's always going to be survivors who don't come to our services, and public policy is a way to serve survivors who are not accessing services. Anything you would add to that, Sara?
Yeah, I would also say, so I am really lucky that I have a job that allows me to help people get safe. I mean, that in many ways is the job I dreamed of having when I was a little girl. Like I want to help. I wanted to be a physician at that time. But I mean, it allows you to help people, and then to be able to take the stories that we hear and translate it to legislators to make a difference, to make an impact that could potentially affect so many more people. You really are translating the boots on the ground into something that can boost the signal, in some cases nationally.
Yeah. I think the little girl, Dr. Sara Brammer, would be very proud of all the incredible achievements that you've made. So that's really cool to hear about. So you all have all of this work that you're doing in your local communities, and you're making time to come to these public policy committee meetings hosted by the coalition. Can you tell us about those meetings and how you move priority issues forward?
I think the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So, this type of advocacy can be really intimidating. And I remember when I first started doing it in Jeff City, and actually maybe even more local than that, and in St. Louis, I was so intimidated and so scared because I felt like I was approaching larger than life folks. And what did they have to care? Why would they care about what I had to say? And then, you do it a few times. And the first couple of times you do it, you're just shadowing somebody who came before you and, learning from them. And so I was fortunate to have wonderful women that came before me that taught me the hows and the whys, and to always have a strategy. And then all before you know it, it becomes your job. Like, okay, you've gone 2 or 3 times now. So now it's your turn for somebody to shadow you. So you have to look confident, right? Like you have to, even if you're not. So you psych yourself up. And, we were telling a few folks last week, like it's that whole fake it till you make it. So I will look confident, I will look self-assured, and I will be shaking on the inside. But still remind myself every time I walk into that building that these people work for me, and they have a responsibility and an obligation. I can't make them care as much as I do, but I can make them not forget about the issue.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then,
yeah. Something I think about is that, I don't know if you're all aware of this, but there's people out there who don't think and talk about domestic and sexual violence every day.
No.
Can you imagine?
No, you're teasing.
Yeah.
Well,
But, yeah, go ahead.
So funny that you say that, just because everyone in my world talks about domestic violence. Even my spouse, who is an accountant by trade and a Walgreens store manager, is like, hey, I've got a domestic violence, and a person who's a survivor in my shelter or my job. Can you help?
Yeah.
And they send all of the survivors to work for my husband because they know he can get connected to shelter. And I'm like, we're slowly taking over the world.
Oh my gosh, you're so
It's a
right.
way of life. It's a way of life. Yeah.
It really is.
Oh my gosh, it totally is. You all are inspiring me and normalizing my experiences so much because
I mean, I don't know if they're normal, Nora. We're just saying that we have the same experiences.
yeah, it's true. The people in my life who
There's
like
probably
don't,
people listening.
yeah, yeah, it's true. It really does rub off on everyone around us, doesn't it,
Mhm.
Sarah? Um, okay, anything else that you wanted to say about the Public Policy Committee meetings, or how you all move the ball forward there? If
I
you
think the coalition does a really good job of keeping us on track. I mean, I think that you're talking about a lot of really passionate advocates. So to get to the meeting, you have to like it well enough to show up at 9 in the morning on a Friday,
yes,
which, I mean, I don't know. 9 in the morning on a Friday is not my favorite time, but they also keep us on track of all the thousands of things that we could talk about. And there's a lot. Thousands is probably not underestimate or an overestimate. We have a lot of things we could talk about. We're constantly focusing on this is the task at hand, and I think that is really useful. So what ends up happening is you have a room full of the fire starters, like the people who want to go make something happen. And to keep us all regulated and like staying on one page is like probably Matthew, who's responsible for it, deserves some sort of award.
yes. And for our listeners, Matthew Huffman is our Chief Public Affairs Officer, and he does facilitate those 9 a.m. meetings on a Friday morning for the Public Policy Committee. So I did want to talk about the legislative session that we just wrapped up in May. It was, how do you say, like an interesting session. So I think it was notable in a lot of stories that are coming out of the legislative session really talk about how unproductive the session was. And in fact, there was just only a very small portion of the bills that were filed that were actually passed, and we'll move on to the governor's desk. Shockingly low, the lowest in several decades. However, I think that there was still some excitement and activity that was generated around MOCADSV priority legislation. And so as you look back over the session, is there anything that stands out to you or any bills that you were particularly excited about? Dr. Brammer, I know Synergy did some really cool work around the getting the bill that said that you can get divorced while pregnant. In fact, there was a national story that Christina Cherry was featured in. That was really cool.
Yeah, so we did a couple of national stories. We were interviewed by CNN and NPR and a variety of those Scribs. We had some live work on Scribs. I have an ABC interview this afternoon at 3. So there's just there was a lot of national interest in the story. And I think it's always interesting for an advocate to have that kind of exposure to the media. Very rarely are we involved in something that gets that kind of attention, like quoted in Vanity Fair. Like, how do you explain that to your board? Like, I don't know why they picked it up. But of all the things, we just had a lot of momentum behind that. And then the most exciting part about that is when we were in Congressman Cleaver's office in DC. There's a group of us from Kansas City, and they came into the meeting with his staffer, and they brought in an example bill. They're planning on filing it at the federal level, and I have the bill draft in front of me from Cleaver's office. That's the Pregnancy Empowerment Act of 2024 that allows women to get divorced regardless of what state they're in. How exciting to be able to have made enough impact that you get a bill filed for the whole country. That's the kind of thing you can have happen. Now, it's never happened to me before, but that's really exciting that it did happen at this time.
Absolutely. So we got attention by having the bill filed in the Missouri legislature, and we didn't see it pass, unfortunately. However, because of the national attention that was generated, partly because of your willing to share information with the media and participate in media stories, we now have some potential change happening at the federal level, which is so exciting. I've never seen that happen.
But I don't know that it's hard to be prepared for that kind of attention in terms of the media. I mean, when you start getting calls from CNN and, those kind of places like NPR, I was on vacation when that dropped. I was on a cruise ship, so I couldn't help with that interview. But you want your staff and yourself to be totally prepared to do that when there's very little training other than the coalition to step out on a national stage and talk about something. It is no small task in terms of the confidence that Jessica talked about earlier, but also just being able to present yourself in a way that is condensed enough that can make movement.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we heard a lot at the coalition when we were talking about that legislation was like, wait, that's a thing? People can't get divorced when they're pregnant in Missouri? So many people didn't even know that was an issue. So when you were talking to the media, was there anything in particular that you found resonated with the media or was a message that was really helpful to get out there about it?
I think the piece of information that was the most taken, every interviewer asked me if I thought the bill would pass. And I universally said, I do not believe that the bill will pass. And they ask often, like, why do you not think it will pass? And I said, there's not a balance of power in Missouri. So the balance of power check isn't there. And so when we have a bill that's important like this, because most legislators, even when we talk to legislators, we're like, are you kidding? Is this a thing?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have information on it. So it's not a bill that legislators even often understand as a problem, which speaks to the importance of advocacy, but also speaks to the importance of educating people about it and then taking it up and boosting the signal that this is a problem. I think that it really does make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, taking it back to some of the things you all were saying earlier around direct services, like I remember having those conversations with survivors about, yes, I know you want divorce. Yes, I know this is, what you want for your safety. Unfortunately, we have this weird thing in Missouri. So it really is something that's going to have a positive impact on survivors of violence if and when we can make that change happen.
I was just going to say, a lot of states also have it hidden in their laws. So although 4 states specifically have it within their disillusionment rules, there's also states like Kentucky that just have it in their law that you can't get divorced. So it's a different avenue by which there's an issue, but lots and lots of states have that problem. So getting federal legislation filed helps everyone.
Yes, absolutely. Fingers crossed on that one.
Yeah. And I think too, realizing too, yes, a national fix is wonderful, but that doesn't mean you stop advocating in Missouri, because we've seen very similar things happen with gun laws, right? Like having good federal gun laws, but if your state law doesn't mimic it, you still got to keep fighting, right? You still got to keep making sure it has that impact.
Right. I mean, we've had a federal law saying that respondents to orders of protection can't have firearms since the 90s, right?
Yep.
And we don't see that happening here in Missouri. And we continue to push for a state law here in Missouri.
Right.
So I'm glad you spoke to that, Jessica.
Yeah. Speaking of public policy, like the Supreme Court Rahimi decision, like literally any minute now. And part of me is hopeful, and part of me is like, just please don't announce it yet, because I can at least live in denial for one more night if it's not a decision that we're happy with.
So, it is anxiety inducing, isn't it?
Very much so.
For any of our listeners who might not be familiar with Rahimi, can you explain it in a nutshell or let us know kind of what's at stake here?
I mean, yes, a nutshell, because I am not a legal scholar. But basically, the Violence Against Women Act in the 90s introduced federal law that said if you had a full order of protection against you, you could not carry a firearm. Missouri has never mimicked that law. So it's really difficult, almost impossible for judges to order the relinquishment of guns. So Rahimi, I forget what state, was it New York? I don't remember. So he is now a convicted felon, so it changes it a little bit. But at the time, he was not a convicted felon, but had a full order of protection against him. And the courts ruled that basically that was a violation of his Second Amendment rights, because he was not a convicted felon at the time. So what the Supreme Court has to decide basically is if they're upholding VAWA, which says if you have an order of protection, that you cannot carry a firearm, or if they're going to find that unconstitutional, because it's a civil case, remember, not a criminal case. So that whole it gets a little tricky on the standard that they have to prove. So what we had been hoping for in Missouri with a good ruling from the Supreme Court, it makes it a lot, I don't want to say easier, but maybe removes a few of the challenges. If you can go to Jeff City and say, look, the U.S. Supreme Court just upheld this. So we are not asking you to do anything that the United States Supreme Court thinks is unconstitutional, and that other very red states similar to Missouri are not already doing. So we're not asking Missouri to be a trailblazer. We're just asking them to catch up a little bit.
Yeah. And so that is something, as you said. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to put it in perspective in Missouri, just specifically related to the Supreme Court ruling on this. In Missouri's law, there are more instructions in the law about what the sign says that says you can't carry a firearm into the building than there are about why you could limit firearm carrying. So for a live example of that, I have offenders who want to carry live into my batters groups. So my job is to challenge their accountability while they're armed.
Wow.
It's why our program went virtual only, because we can't keep our staff safe. But anyway, just throwing it into the live of what that looks like in Missouri is offenders are carrying guns and we can't really stop them.
Wow, that's such an important point. Could you say that again? Just in case anyone missed it, because I thought it was a really
So in Missouri, there's more rules in our legislation about the sign that says don't carry a firearm in this building, and the print and the size of the letters and the color of the letters and all of that. Then there are actual ways to prohibit offenders from carrying guns.
Wow.
So when when an offender shows up in our building with a firearm, we can ask them to take it back because we have the sign correctly as displayed. But they still want to have their firearm with them in an open live batters intervention group.
Wow.
If you look about the risks of that for our staff, for survivors in general, you're really risking all kinds of things having that group live. We took all of our groups virtual because we can't keep our staff safe. Even if we have an officer armed outside the room, we still can't keep enough people safe if there's firearms in the room.
Such an interesting and important point, Sarah. Thank you. And so at the coalition, we're certainly going to be keeping an eye out for that Supreme Court decision. It should, like Jessica said, could be coming any day now. And we'll be a landmark decision for our work here.
Also, just as not to end the conversation about firearms, because it's such an important topic, but I also want to talk about VOCA and that we didn't fall off the cliff. I mean, the truth of the matter is, there's so much fear going into this with the VOCA shortfall and needing a second VOCA fix nationally. But Missouri didn't fall off the cliff. When we met nationally about VOCA, some shelters had to close because they didn't have the right funding. Because VOCA was, there was a shortfall in the funding. And so I think it really speaks to Missouri and what we're doing right. There's a lot of times where we get focused on what's going wrong, but we didn't fall off the cliff.
Yes, I'm so glad.
We're still teetering. We're still teetering.
We're holding our breath.
Don't take off the harness yet. Don't take off the harness yet.
So
at this point, we have not fallen off the cliff today. So we are very grateful. And I just want to highlight something that's going right. Is because we didn't have to change anything because of VOCA shortfalls.
Yeah.
No, and I don't minimize that. I'm just teasing.
I know.
When I look at,
Like holding your breath
like,
for
I
a
also
long
think
time.
because you've done this work for so long, you, like, sometimes I think we could, I don't know how to say the past, like, I think sometimes gaslighting is happening, right? Because we've also been flat since 2019. And
Yeah.
we get to a point where, like, thank you, thank you, thank you. Like, we didn't get cut and we all celebrate and we're excited. But what that means is the last 5 years, shelters and everybody else has had to work that much harder to still pay their workers a living wage,
Mhm.
because just because VOCA didn't increase doesn't mean that we couldn't, like, staff still has to feed their families and put a roof over their head.
Mhm.
So all of that 4% increase, which is 4%, right? Like, it makes me sad that I even have to say out loud that shelter staff only gets 4% increase each year. But that 4% over the last 5 years has had to be covered by unrestricted funds.
Well,
Because,
oh, sorry.
no, I'm just saying, just because, we didn't get cut, but it kind of is a cut.
Well,
Yeah.
there's been an 18% inflation rate in that 5-year
Mhm.
period. And so
Mhm.
when you think of it that way, if we have an 18% inflation, what we could have paid in
Mhm.
2019 is now 18% more. So we
Mhm.
didn't fall off the cliff, but what we did do isn't anything cushy either. I'm
Mm-mm.
just grateful that we didn't fall off the cliff, but you
Sure.
are not wrong with the piece of inflation and all of that.
Yes, absolutely. And we do have to celebrate our legislative victories here in Missouri.
Mhm.
And I would say, walking away from the 2024 session, we're definitely looking at appropriations as our biggest win.
Yep.
And a lot of that success came, I think, in big part to Missouri Capital Advocacy Days, which MOCADSV hosted back in February. Every Wednesday in February, we invited our members to come to Jefferson City and talk to their elected officials about what was going on in their local communities and why it was so important to fund these life-saving services. You all attended Capital Advocacy Days, as you have for many years. But as you think back about your meetings this year, is there anything that you want to speak to or anything that stands out to you about going to the Capitol for Capital Advocacy Days last February?
I have to remember February.
I know, it was a long time ago.
Hard to picture on this 100-degree
It was
day.
cold outside.
Right. I love advocacy days. I love bringing staff. I mean, I think we were there every Wednesday except one.
Yeah.
I love bringing new staff that have never been, because they're so scared, right?
Mhm.
And so you make it like, there's also, like, I know this is not what you meant, but I also love this too. Like, there's also tradition that comes with just the road trip, right? Like, no, you stop at the McDonald's Warren County. We don't stop before that. We don't stop after that.
Yeah.
And then we go to to Ari's for the pizza buffet. But, like, but those things are important too, right? Because it's building the team. It's those traditions are important. So I love seeing people from across the state. I love seeing the coalition have, like, this whole little spot to themselves, and, like, you turn the corner and you look at the advocates that are with you and you're like, okay, those are our people, right? Like, those are our people. That's who we're going to talk to. And then reminding staff, like, okay, we might have 4 appointments today. And I mean, there's a good chance we're not going to see anybody. but but here's how you do that. You leave your stuff behind. You follow up with an email. And if you work at St. Martha, you better also be following up with a handwritten note the day you get back to St. Louis, because people remember that. So it just gives you such an opportunity to do so many things, even bigger than just meeting with your legislator and sharing that passion.
Yeah.
It helps that cohesiveness.
St. Martha's has always been committed to that handwritten note, and I can't even imagine the amount of change that has happened in this world because of your handwritten notes at St. Martha's. It's so
That's a
true.
great
People love
idea,
those
Jessica. I
handwritten
may have to steal it.
notes.
Oh yeah, I stole that one a long time ago from them,
That's a
Sarah.
great idea. I don't know that I actually do that, but I think that that's a great.
Y'all
It
had a
stands out in a different way.
Yeah. Y'all had a lot of representation from Kansas City, Sarah. It was just great to have you all there, and from St. Louis as well. Was there anything you wanted to say about Capital Advocacy Days?
First of all, every representative that we met with was really, really wonderful. I mean, we didn't have a bad experience regardless of what office, what color the office was, red or blue. Everyone was really happy to see us. We really had a great reception. I think that for me, there were champions. Lauren Arthur is always a champion of this movement. I know that her time in Jeff City is almost over, which is deeply sad for us, as she is in Clay County. And so I can't wait to see her in her next kind of task. We also had some new folks come forward. Ashley Awning, who was the original sponsor of the pregnancy, marriage and pregnancy. And she was phenomenal to work with. I have absolutely only wonderful things to say about her. Even in DC, when Cleaver brought out this bill, they asked kind of the room, who has contact with the representative who filed this? And I was like, I can text her. I texted her and she called. I walked across the room with my cell phone and handed it to Cleaver's office staff. And I said, you want to talk to her? And they said, is this the representative? And I'm like, yeah, she's a friend of mine. I mean, I think that kind of like commitment from people, and that kind of like boots on the ground, like we're in this together, that really makes champions for me. Like, you know enough and you care enough to answer your phone when legislative session is over.
Yeah.
In Missouri, and you just happen to know I'm in DC. She'll also be at some of our community events, like our fundraisers in the summer. Again, her job for the season is over, and she's still helping the cause. And I just really appreciate that. That's been really awesome. But everyone universally was wonderful to meet with. There wasn't a bad meeting at all.
And I think relationship building just really speaks to the incredible reputation you have, Sara, and the relationships that you've been able to build because of the incredible work that you do. Sorry, Jessica, go ahead.
No, that's okay. One of the things I always remind myself too is, I talked about being fortunate enough to have so many women who came before me, who kind of led the way. And you can't talk about advocacy in Missouri and not think of Colleen Coble, right? So one thing that I always have in my head is, like, I remember her looking at me like in the eyes, right? And being like, Jessica, we don't have enemies. We have friends we haven't made yet, right? Like, there's no such thing as the other side of the aisle. There's no, and I have to remind myself of that all the time, because there are some meetings you go into and you're really excited because you're talking to Congresswoman Ann Wagner and she introduced the VOCA bill, and like, it's going to be a great meeting. And there's some meetings that you're like, this could go either way. Not that you think it's going to necessarily go bad, but that you're just not going to really leave and make any progress, from where you started. But when you go in with that perspective, it does change. Like, we're probably not going to, change the world in one meeting, but there's a way to get there. You just have to find it. And sometimes it's not in a way that you would expect, but you get there. So.
For our listeners, Colleen Coble is the former CEO of MOCADSV. She retired just a couple of years ago, but was our primary lobbyist for 34 years, and really, I think, made a lot of friends and a lot of positive public policy change in those 34 years.
Trailblazer, really.
Trailblazer. Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. We all have those Colleen sayings that stick in our heads, don't we?
Oh,
yeah. So you all have talked about your trip to DC, and I think a lot of the public policy developments that were happening at the state level have kind of trickled into some of the work happening at the national level. And so I'd love to hear about how National Advocacy Days went with NEAESV and NNEDV. Anything that stands out? It sounds like you had a memorable trip, and there was an opening reception that sounds like it was a lot of fun. I'm kind of jealous I didn't get to go, but I would love to hear if there's anything that stands out to y'all about going to DC last week.
I would say the Cleaver bill. I've been to DC several times, and I'll be honest, that kind of thing has never happened. I think you hear about it in like the movies or something.
Yeah.
Totally. Like, I was struck silent, which doesn't happen very often, for a good couple of minutes, like literally sat there trying to get myself not to cry in this meeting because they heard us.
Yeah.
You just don't get heard like that. But every person in DC was equally happy, from Howley's office to Cleaver's office. People were willing to talk to us, passionate about hearing what we had to say, it really was a welcoming environment from my perspective.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
and the national network always does a great job of having, places where we can debrief and talk about our experience. So I appreciated that as well.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
I agree. It's busy, 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 long days, wear comfy shoes. But if you have an opportunity to do it, I mean, it feels so empowering. Like it really does. And I've gone several times and I still, um, okay, this is so cheesy, but we were talking a couple times about the movie American President. So, like, if you haven't seen it, you have to watch it before you go advocate, because it's, I mean, it's a romantic comedy kind of thing, but it's all like based in advocacy. And but there's so many good one-liners in it about what we're doing. So you get kind of nostalgic, right? Like it's hard not to see the memorials and the Capitol and the Supreme Court, and it kind of like you kind of feel it lift you up, right? Like, and it sort of makes your heart like, okay, like I've got a responsibility to do this. This is important. This is what our country's based on.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Is that a movie with national treasure Gina Davis, who is president? I don't think I'm familiar with that movie, but
No, it's
oh,
Annette Bening and Michael Douglas.
oh man, also national
He's the
treasure.
president. She's a lobbyist. I mean, what
Oh,
else could you?
where have I been my whole life?
I
I
know
need
I
to.
it's a
haven't watched it
really
either.
old
I wrote it
movie.
down on a post-it note
It's
so I can watch it.
wild. Me and
Oh,
Angela Hirsch from here, I'm calling her out here. Like
okay,
several times, we're like, it's just like the movie. Yeah.
that's wonderful. Okay, we'll put a link to the movie in our show notes. I will be
Put a
sure
link
to
to the
watch.
movie, right?
Thanks for that tip. Well, thank you all both for just going to DC. I think what's really standing out to me as you all are talking is that these issues around federal law and state law are not entirely separate, and survivors are all impacted by it equally, no matter where it's coming from. And our advocacy is important at all of these different levels. And so it means a lot that you all took time out of your busy schedules to go all the way to DC.
The coalition made it easy, so that's much appreciated.
They really did. They've got it with the Casey from the lobbyist. It was so easy, and it was also great to see everyone. You just don't get to I don't get to have a happy hour meal with Jessica very often. So
Right.
it
This
was
is how
nice.
we usually see each other.
Right, or a presentation that we're asked to do. Right, like
Right.
I think that piece, like I made really good friends with a Kentucky shelter director.
Great.
And she and I are just friends. Like we send each other gifts of what we're doing,
Yeah.
and she's there, and she came over, and we gave each other giant hugs because we haven't seen each other since for a while. And it's those kind of things, those connections you make across this country that are just really cool. It makes it worth
Mhm.
going back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
There is something special about sharing a meal together. It just is so fundamental and seals the deal on that relationship building piece of advocacy work. It really does. And I just want to say we had more people attend National Advocacy Days than I believe we ever have from Missouri before. We had 20 people attending, and that was just
Awesome.
so exciting that,
Yeah.
Well, Missouri was kind of famous. They kept saying, well,
Sure.
and all the Missouri people. And I think Matthew, you'll have to ask Matthew and Cheryl, they were there as well. I think they got like, how do you get all your members involved? And they were kind of like approached with how do you motivate your members to want to do this? Because most states like Kentucky only had a couple people there.
And it's
Yeah,
usually their coalition people. It's
yeah.
not the agencies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because we have just incredible members that are willing to go the extra mile like you all always have. And so uh, it's just really wonderful. And I think we've been able to make a lot of positive change happen. So as we're wrapping up our conversation, I do want to say, kind of bouncing off of that point of members going the extra mile and doing incredible things, making change happen outside of the walls of your shelters. You all are just very clearly committed to making positive social change happen. And so as we're ending, do you have any final thoughts about your public policy work or promising changes that you're seeing happening either in your local community, in the state of Missouri, or at the federal level? Anything else you wanted to speak to with our time together today?
So somebody I've heard this said lots of different ways, but basically you have to be willing to plant the seed and never be able to benefit from the shade of the tree that grows from that seed, right? So we may never see the true impact of what we are doing day to day. And there might not be qualitative data that shows that what I'm doing is making a difference. But I believe with my whole heart and soul that what I'm doing makes a difference. And that's what I would encourage people to believe when things get hard, when things get tough, that absolutely trust your instinct and know that what you're doing makes a difference.
I'm going to think about that seed in that tree for a long time, Jessica. Thank you.
I'm not stealing that. I did not say that. So
anything else you want to say?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I would say the reason the Cleaver bill was so impactful, I said earlier, I sat there silent for a couple minutes because I didn't think I could speak without crying. Partially because very rarely do you get an opportunity, or do I get an opportunity to see something bloom.
Mm-hmm.
And something like a media interview, I mean, there's some of those you can't really control, and people feel sort of ambivalent about talking to the media because you don't always get to say what you want and certainly don't look the way you want and all of those things. This was like a very clear example that what we're doing matters. Mm-hmm. Like we have a voice, even if we don't think we have a voice. And honestly, I got really choked up by the idea that somebody heard me, that the message I was sending was loud enough. The signal was strong enough that they heard it all the way in DC. I'm going to not talk about it anymore because I mean, like, it was so impressive. I was like, oh my gosh, I did have a drink that night afterwards. I was like, let's celebrate the work we've done.
Oh, yes. And I love ending on that note because it is hard work and it is tireless work that goes on for, in both of your cases, decades. And we got to celebrate those successes and celebrate those wins.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Sara and Jessica, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's just been a wealth of information, and I appreciate your time so much. So thank you for joining me on the podcast. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you listeners for tuning in. We certainly appreciate it, and we hope that you join us next month for another episode of Momentum for Change. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.